Fantastic. No. Let it be. Fantastic. Right. Then with all of that being said, I think we can... Hello everyone, welcome again to the Freedom Alternative. We are in Kyiv in an attic and I am here with Roman Skaskiw or Skaskiw. Roman, welcome to the Freedom Alternative.
Thank you, Lucian. I've been listening to your channel for a while now and I'm honored to be here.
Okay, that's great. What's even greater is that we're in an attic. I mean, seriously, in an attic.
Yes. In
the middle of Kyiv. The embassy of Armenia is right across the street. So yeah, in this conspirative framework, let's talk about a few things. We don't actually have a script for this, so we'll see where the conversation leads. First of all, I'm going to start with the things that the fans asked me to ask around here, namely the economics of Ukraine. So let's start with the economics. How are things going here, and especially how have they been going in the last, let's put it in the last 3 years, since the troubles started?
Sure. If you look up the official economic data, say on the World Bank or on Wikipedia, you will see that it's miserable and getting slightly better. I think the reality is that it's not so bad and getting slightly better. The reason it appears miserable is because half the economy remains underground. Since the war started, trust in regional governments and city governments has gone up considerably. Trust in the central government remains low. The big glaring failure is obvious to everyone. I think there's huge consensus. It's not moving far enough, fast enough on anti-corruption.
Would I be mistaken if I were to say that there has never been a huge level of trust in the Kyiv central government?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There have been extremely naive, sort of starry-eyed hopes and then horrible disappointments. Yeah.
Right. So you said that the trust in the regional governments has gone up significantly. Is there... Would we be mistaken if we were to say that there is an increase, there is a cultural trend towards more federalism?
Oh, that's a really interesting discussion. I might be biased by my own desire and my own view that Ukrainian federalism, not this Trojan horse Russian federalism that they're pushing, but a Ukrainian federalism would be great. So I might be biased by that. And there is a tradition of the Magdeburg Right that stretches all the way out here to Ukraine. There's a monument not far from where we are to the Magdeburg Right. So it's a good thing. Is there a trend toward that? I don't know. It's in the mix. People probably know the idea. It doesn't seem like a force, but people know what it is. Maybe that's a start. And I don't know where your viewers are from. But just to get a sense of Ukraine, I want to quote Lucian. I want to quote you and say that the government you have here is not really a democracy. It's its own thing, which is post-communism. We need to regard post-communism as a thing, and that's Ukraine's government. It's a lot of people who are Soviet officials. I think you put it more harshly. You said collaborators. But it's a typical problem that you have here in the intermarium. But Ukraine has it worse. In the 90s, when Poland was privatizing and doing things, Ukraine's governments were just rent-seeking and infrastructure was collapsing. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, the phrase post-communism doesn't necessarily belong to me, although I have popularized it much more. It belongs to the Polish philosopher Branislaw Wilstein. Nevertheless, yeah, it is much. I mean, in Poland they complain that, well, the judiciary is full of former communist apparatchiks and commie-era appointees and whatnot, which is true, and it's a serious issue. But in Ukraine, well, except for the police every other structure of the state is full of these people. And the police, because recently there was that radical reform in which everyone who worked under the communist regime in the former militia were forcefully retired or fired or whatnot.
There's a new police force. No longer do the cops on the street look like walking criminal enterprises. They're young, they seem idealistic, they seem more or less trustworthy. City beautification has happened everywhere. I was awestruck the last time my wife and I drove through the country. Like, everything just looks nicer, so there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. Investment is increasing, the economy is getting better, anti-corruption remains the big failure. Are jokes okay on your show? I assume they are. So did you know that Ukraine was considered for the Nobel Prize in Economics in the 90s because they managed to invent an economic system that was even worse than communism?
The same thing, there was a joke made by a state official in the Republic of Moldova who said that, at one moment Moldova had the most stable economy in Europe. When everyone else was either collapsing or having huge fluctuations, Moldova was the most stable. And the Minister of Economic Affairs was like, yes, we are indeed very stable. We have the stability of a cemetery. Nobody is dying. Nobody is dying anymore because everyone is dead already.
So we continue to produce the best jokes in the world.
Oh, of course. I usually joke with when I say this with my older friends that when the jokes are very good, that's usually a sign that the country is doing bad. Because the new jokes that have emerged in the last 10 years from the Intermarium are all quite crap. And that's because things are actually getting better.
Yes.
And they're getting better in spite of the fact that both you and I and the citizens in general, they do complain about things. But, we complain about things that are they're problems that many societies would have wished to have. Who would have thought that in the 80s we would be complaining that, there is a big failure on anti-corruption in Ukraine. Well, in the big 80s, there was a huge failure of bread lines. So, when you put it on a continuum, things have actually gotten better.
And I think there is this optimism throughout the Intermarium because, there's this feeling, I think, we at least straddle libertarian circles. There's this feeling that government can't be reformed, it only gets worse and worse. But here in the Intermarium, we know that things can get better. We saw communism end.
We saw communism and we saw the radical reforms in Georgia. Some reforms.
We saw Maidan.
We saw Maidan. We saw several reforms here. Sure, not to the extent that you and I probably wanted to, but much more than we would have, than many libertarians would have expected, let's say in 2003. Who would have thought in 2003 or 2002 was the first time I came to Ukraine. Even in my best moments, I would not have thought that the police here can be reformed. I just couldn't. I was like, this is going to stay like that for decades to come. It's horrible and whatnot. And there you go. It happened. Same thing in Poland and in Hungary. I mean, in Hungary, who would have thought in 1987 that things would go that well? I mean, at this moment, Budapest, for instance, has 150% of the EU's per capita GDP. There is a very, very wealthy city, and considering Hungary is a small country.
I didn't realize that.
Things have gotten really well in terms of, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of the functionalities of the state. Sure, there is still corruption, but as we were talking before we start the show, there is also corruption in the places that are perceived as being less corrupt. We were talking about the Karolinska hospital in Stockholm, a hospital that's allegedly to cost $40 billion, in which a door costs $1 million. And inspecting the door, it's 800,000 euros.
Perception is really important. I think Intermarium corruption, it happens more at the interface of the state and the regular person. So a regular person might get shaken down for a bribe in order for the bureaucrat to do their job. And that is perception, and that is dangerous. I think in the West, I used to tell Ukrainians who are really down on themselves, in the West they have better masks. The interface is more or less clean. You don't have to pay a bribe to get your driver's license or to do some regular thing with the local bureaucracy. But maybe it's a sign of the West's wealth, but the official corruption, like the Cylindra solar power scandal in the U.S., or you were telling me about the Nord Stream pipeline and Germany's dealings, like the scale of that is mind-boggling. I'm not sure whether you see the equivalent here or do. I actually think you probably do. You think the intermarium is notably less corrupt. I think the best you can say is it's not as bad as it seems.
Well, it is on the scale of it. It is less corrupt. I mean, there has not yet been proven or even alleged a scandal in which a prime minister of an intermarium country would get literally several dozens of bags of cash from a foreign power to authorize some big infrastructure spending, like it happened in Germany with Gerhard Schröder and the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. I mean, these kinds of things just don't happen. It was recently the case 2 years ago in Bucharest. The mayor was caught as having received a bribe in cash of like 10,000 euros, probably even less than that, to authorize something really small, like an apartment building or things like that. It was a huge scandal. The mayor is still in jail now, and they're talking about a sentence of up to 20 years. I mean, there was a very serious thing. It was taken very, very seriously. Whereas in Germany, no one cares. Gerhard Schröder was fine until he died. His protege, Angela Merkel, just got re-elected. There was no consequence when things were found out and exposed to the public.
That's interesting.
I mean, the public is more sensitive to corruption in the intermarium, and things really do happen to get done once an instance of corruption is being unveiled. But in the former Western Bloc, not so much.
I wonder if you can contribute all or part of that to being more homogenous as a society. For me, one of the lessons of Maidan was that like you get freedom when you're willing to fight for your neighbor. Like the Maidan had huge nationalist overtones, and I can't imagine it happening in like New York City or something.
New York, no.
Yeah, where I grew up in New York. I didn't speak the same language as my next door neighbor.
Yeah, well, this goes into a very controversial topic, the topic of diversity. I mean, at the end of the day, this whole thing with diversity is our strength. It's going to have to die. With that said, I'm not. You know very well. We've spoke about this before the show. That I'm not particularly a big fan of these big identitarian claims. With that said, failure to acknowledge the drawbacks of diversity is quite a serious issue, and it's happening all over the former Western Bloc, and not so much here.
Well, it's very difficult in the West to bring up these ideas at all. One of the benefits of being in the intermarium is you don't have to be crazy about it because everyone takes it for granted. And I think as we look westward, we're like, oh, we better not take it for granted. Like Poland is taking all these steps. A couple days ago, they did that huge prayer where millions of Poles went to the border and prayed. And it was a beautiful thing.
And the BBC called that controversial.
I saw that headline today.
Even though that kind of prayer has been taking place for about 1,000 years now.
Oh, is that right? It wasn't a special event?
No, it wasn't a special event. Well, actually, it's not 1,000 years, more like 600 years. There was a huge victory of the Polish nobility against Islam in the 1300s, and it's the anniversary of that. And also, about 100 and something years ago, there was another event that's very special for Catholics. It's considered a miracle that occurred in Portugal at the same date. So basically, these are the two reasons why those prayers are taking place. It
was probably bigger this year because it had additional meaning.
Yeah, but it was slightly bigger. But again, the Poles getting to those borders and praying to those particular churches that are surrounding, it's not really something special.
Yeah, the fact that the BBC calls it controversial is itself a story.
Yeah, they call it controversial, but they don't call it controversial when Muslim prayers are taking place.
Right, shut down the middle of Paris.
The middle of Paris, the middle of Moscow, the middle of Stockholm, the middle of London. That's not controversial, and sometimes it doesn't even make it to the paper that it happened.
No points for pointing out leftist hypocrisy. It's everywhere.
Yeah, but then again, BBC is being presented to us as this big arbiter of truth and this big reputable source, full of neutrality and whatnot. I mean, I consider myself lower than the BBC because I admit up front I'm not neutral, I'm not impartial, I'm very partisan of the things that I promote. Maybe BBC should do the same thing. I mean, would it be that hard if the BBC would admit, yeah, we're here to promote leftism? That's why I respect The Guardian a lot more than I respect the BBC. Because The Guardian is open about it. Yeah, The Guardian is open about it. Look, we're a newspaper, we're trying to promote leftism here. That's fine. At least be honest about what you're doing. So when I read something from The Guardian, I know what perspective I'm getting.
Yes.
With the BBC...
If your viewers are interested in following Ukraine's economy a little bit better, an acquaintance of mine started a journal called the Ukraine Business Journal. Quite a bit of it is behind a paywall, but a lot of it is also available. And that just every day pushes out interesting stories about the business happenings here in Ukraine. Should we talk about the IT sector?
Yeah, let's get to the IT sector and then we'll get to more contentious politics. The IT sector is much more behind than the rest of the intermarium here. I mean, compared to the hubs, technology hubs in Warsaw, in Bucharest, in my hometown, in Tallinn, I mean, compared to other places in the intermarium, it's quite behind in Ukraine.
I'm surprised you would say that, because Ukrainians certainly don't think so, and I didn't think so. Estonia was running advertisement in Ukraine trying to encourage Ukrainian developers to move to Tallinn.
Yeah, but that's because there's much more capital there. It's much more development there. Now they have a shortage of labor, but they don't have a shortage of capital and the investment and development.
Okay, well,
from that perspective, I was saying not that there is a shortage of talent. Of course, there isn't.
Right. Well, how it compares, I'm not sure, but it is about officially 3% of the economy, which is a lot. There's about 100,000 developers here. Unofficially, it could be much more than 3% of the economy because, as I said, so much of it is underground. You can't keep track of, just a bunch of guys rent an apartment and outsource their work. Part of what made it an IT hub is that, for the longest time before this revolution, there was the feeling that you couldn't make it anywhere because the government would take away your business. Under Yanukovych, the corporate rating was a huge problem. As soon as your business was successful, someone connected to President Yanukovych would threaten you, shake you down, take your business. So, people viewed IT as sort of the only road to redemption. So it wasn't that some of the smart people were going into IT, it was that most of them seemed to be going in IT. So that sector is booming. Mostly it's been people selling their talent abroad, but increasingly it's people building stuff here. There has been one very big exit. It was that company that sort of did real-time animations to give yourself a dog nose or flowers or ears, and they were bought by Snapchat for I think 150 million. That's the biggest exit of a Ukrainian company that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's quite. It's interesting that you mentioned that because it's basically how it was in Romania also until, let's say, early 2000s. By 2002 it was no longer the case, but it was the case especially in the 90s. The politicians and the state in general was corrupt and aggressive, but also very behind its time. So it didn't even understand the IT sector at all. And for almost a decade, it didn't even know it existed.
Right.
So it was by far the best chance of building wealth for yourself, building prestige for yourself, and generally having a business without too much bother from the state.
Right, and when they do look at it like the hooligan apes that they are, they just look, oh, nothing to steal, keep going.
Yeah, that's basically, I mean, they couldn't understand it for most of the time. That's how Romania got to be the third fastest, the country with the third fastest internet in the world. Because by the time they figured it out, that what those nerds were doing there up on the poles was, basically infrastructure, just like electricity. By the time they figured that one out and wanted to regulate it, it was already all over the place, so there was nothing to regulate anymore. So yeah. With that said, it's probably the territorial challenge too. The internet speeds are much lower here than they are.
They're much lower. That's true. Yep.
And slightly more expensive, although they have gotten cheaper in the last 2 years.
I have much easier time finding Wi-Fi here than I do back where I started in New York City. Yeah, and my phone bill is less than $2 a month.
Yeah, well, okay, but then again, I'm comparing with Romania. I'm not comparing with Germany or New York, which are indeed very Wi-Fi free places. Let me put it this way, particularly Germany. with which I'm very familiar, and that's not.
I actually don't know that much about the rest of the Intermarium, which is one of the reasons I'm so happy that you came here. Outside of Estonia, I haven't done any business in the other countries. We should do another show where I just ask you questions.
Yeah, we'll do that, sure. Right. So enough with the economics. Let's go to the contentious politics. For instance, how much of a force is Western-style leftism here? Because looking, and I'm going to try my best to simulate an outsider's perspective. Looking from an outsider, you think of like people like Femen, maybe a few academics here and there, but that's pretty much it. That's how it looks from the outside. Is there any, let's say, a political party that openly goes for Western style of leftism?
No, the politics here is less ideological than the West. Like the politics here looks like different corrupt business people competing with each other. So is it going to be this clan of oligarchs versus that clan of oligarchs? I guess maybe that's changing a little bit with Saakashvili, the former Georgian president. He's much more reform-minded than Poroshenko. But I think that, I don't know if he'll run for president next year. I hope he does. But that's probably the most ideological presidential election, arguably, in a long time.
Tell me more about Saakashvili.
I guess Yushchenko-Yanukovych, the 2004 election, was also a little bit ideological.
I was about to say that.
Yeah, it wasn't just oligarchs competing for power. It was the Western-minded one versus the Eastern-minded one versus the Russian-minded one. But about Saakashvili, he was president of Georgia when they made what libertarians should have known all about and should have celebrated wildly. Made some incredible reforms, firing all their bureaucrats. Can you imagine? Firing all the bureaucrats, rebuilding the police stations to symbolize the openness and honesty that he wanted to convey. All of this was 2007, 2008, and then Russia invaded in 2009 and seized 2 territories from Georgia.
Yeah, the Abkhazia and Ossetia.
Right. So 7-8 years later, we have our Maidan revolution here, and Saakashvili is invited by President Poroshenko to become was he the mayor or the governor?
The governor.
He was the governor of
Ossetia Oblast.
Yeah, governor of one of the most corrupt oblasts, which is Odessa, Ukraine's major port. Yeah, so major entry point for a ton of goods, huge cesspool of corruption. He invited Saakashvili to be the governor there. Saakashvili became increasingly vocal that the president only appointed him symbolically and was not serious about doing any reforms. And then he got even more vocal, saying the president is actively blocking my reforms. And some crazy thing happened a few months ago, and I'm not sure if it was a callous publicity stunt, but I mean there was some truth behind it because we can see the lead up to it. But his Ukrainian citizenship was revoked, so he fled the country. And then a few months later,
about 3 weeks ago, he forced himself back.
3 weeks ago, did a very publicized sort of walking across the border, where the completely unprepared and, in my mind, unprofessional Ukrainian border guards were just let themselves be overwhelmed by a mob of his supporters, and he just walked into the country. I don't know if that was staged or half-staged or what. I mean, it was at least half-staged.
Yeah. He definitely called his supporters to wait for him there.
Right.
With that said, I don't think he could have predicted how incompetent the border patrol will be, or whether the train will be allowed, because he tried to come with the train from Warsaw.
He first tried by train, and when they stopped the train, he walked across. So anyway, since then he's met with the mayor of Lviv, who was also considered a distant rival to President Poroshenko. And the thing that scares me is that Poroshenko has consolidated power so much, so there are very few viable rivals. In fact, those are probably the two, the mayor of Lviv and Saakashvili. But so he met with
of Lviv has always been doing his own thing there. I mean, it's not like the first time that he's dissenting from national politics. If I recall correctly, he wanted at one moment, half-jokingly said, if you piss me off too much, I'm going to declare Lviv region an autonomous state, and then what? And he was taken seriously because well, he would not necessarily do it, but everyone knew that you don't mess around with that guy because he's been doing his own thing there for quite some time. And
Yes.
Unlike other, I guess in Romania we'd call them local barons, he's actually popular there. And if you drive through the Lviv region, you can realize why.
Actually, I lived in Lviv for 2 years, and I have relatives there. And the last time one of my relatives visited me here in Kyiv, he had an argument with the taxi driver where the guy from Lviv, was talking about how corrupt Sadovi was. And the taxi driver who's from Kyiv says, we know all that, but it's not on the scale of Poroshenko. So there's some evidence that that's actually backwards, that the people in Lviv have lived with his corruption and are sick of him, but his image lives on in the rest of Ukraine.
Yeah, and that
and I do think he is a lot less corrupt than Poroshenko, and I'll just cite one fairly obvious bit of evidence. He would walk to the mayor's office without bodyguards in Lviv, which, like, for the type of sort of gangster mayor that occupies some other major cities like Odessa or Kharkiv, like, that would be unheard of. So I'm behind him I would be behind him for that reason.
That and the fact that now we're talking national politics, so most of his small-time petty nonsense that he did there would matter maybe 4 or 5 percentage point in the Lviv region, but no one in Kharkiv would give a damn about that, or no one in Odessa would go.
Or they've seen so much worse.
Part of that, and part because they might not even know it, because people don't, especially people in other countries of Europe, both in the Intermarium and outside of it, people don't realize just how big this country is. I mean, it's not like it's comparable in a way with Germany, but the territorially is even bigger than that. So in most cases, you don't even read the news. I mean, if you're in Odessa in the southeast, you don't read the news from Lviv.
Could be.
Most of the time, there is a lot of disconnect in that direction.
But getting back to Saakashvili, so re-entered the country, hung out with the mayor of Lviv, and when his political ambitions then became completely obvious because he met this extremely corrupt oligarch named Kolomoisky in Dnipropetrovsk. Kolomoisky, he took Ukrainian side, and he risked his personal wealth taking Ukrainian side in the war. So some props to him for that. But he is so corrupt. He's the one that kept some discount airlines, including Ryanair, out of Kiev because it didn't win competition. Ryanair specifically fingered him as it being his fault. More recently, his huge bank, Privatbank, got nationalized, and something like $6 billion went missing, which is really impressive because that's what the M2 monetary supply is, just like 40 or 45 million. So what is that, like 1/7 of the monetary supply
of the M2? Yeah.
So I know a guy who works for Ernst & Young. And he just said, like, that the type of nonsense that happens here in banking is, like, beyond the pale. Like, he just can't believe it.
Well, I can invite your friend into other countries. If he can't believe this, then he should try see how banking works in Azerbaijan, for instance.
Okay.
He'll suddenly love Ukrainian banking, believe me. Anyway,
Saakashvili met with him, which is a big signal that he has political ambitions. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't think Poroshenko did a horrible job. Big failure on... Man, if the wrong people hear that, they will string me up. Seriously. A huge failure on anti-corruption. A lot of people say that he's hugely corrupt, stealing giant chunks of the defense budget. I don't know.
That's quite a serious accusation. I mean, I'd love to see some evidence of that.
Yeah.
I mean, generally that he's corrupt, I can believe it, because he's a politician. All politicians tend to be corrupt. I mean, show me one non-corrupt politician and I'll start eating chunks of this later. But, a pointed accusation like that with a defense budget, especially with the current situation in this country, that's a serious accusation.
Yeah, very serious accusation. I'm not in a position to comment on its veracity. So, I just know what I hear. Failure on anti-corruption and consolidation of power, which is a little bit scary. So I'm a little distant from Ukrainian politics. I read Russian only very slowly. I read Ukrainian moderately. but I'm kind of immersed in my job right now, so I'm a little distant, and that's fine with me. I need a break.
Right. Let me ask you, and if you're not aware of it, you can discount it. I have heard from several individuals, and I've read it only in very low-tier newspapers. So please do, if you know it's bullshit, just tell me it's bullshit. There have been several cases of journalists who have dissenting journalists. I don't know whatever that is. That have been jailed for allegedly offending the state and things like that. And the biggest outrage of the people that were telling me these things were like, rapists got smaller sentences than those guys. Do you know anything about this? And if you don't, that's fine.
I don't know if this is the same issue or not, but there were a couple of sort of like Russian propagandist type journalists.
I figured that could be
that got kicked out. That might be a different thing, though.
Yeah, but kicked out. These were jailed.
These were jailed. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of that at all.
Okay, then I'll have to ask further.
You had asked about the SJW cultural Marxist inflows here. To me, it seems really small. Mm-hmm. And like in many intermarium countries, we see it happening in the West, and enough people don't want it that they will protest that. Mm-hmm. You hear it in the universities considerably among like Ukrainian pseudo-intellectuals who think that it's just sort of a rote copying of the West, and I hate it. It's like copying bad ideas poorly. I don't know if we should celebrate the fact that they're being copied poorly, or be sad that they're copying dumb Western ideas. Mm-hmm. But sort of the academia doesn't have near the influence in Ukraine like it does in the West. Mm-hmm. So it seems small and far away, and actively monitored by people who will take to the streets to counter protest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's refreshing, because in Poland and in Romania there actually is a political party in each country that has these kinds of elements. Now, admittedly, they're not hugely popular. Right. They barely enter the parliament. Most of the times they miss the threshold in the parliament, and their influence is de facto null, but they still do exist, and the fact that they still don't exist here is quite reassuring. I guess it helps that in many parts of this country there is still the old mentality that that guy is a professor in a high school, gets more respect than being a professor in a university. So in general there is this tendency that I see in rural Romania and here also, that, well, who's that guy? An academic, who cares? Huh. It's taken, an academic is taken a lot less seriously, especially if it's not an academic in engineering or something here, serious.
Definitely. Here too, I think here what I get, it's just the universities are really poor, just like all the other government institutions. So the best people don't go there, and the ones that do often have to resort to corruption from their students. So people kind of are very wary of academia for those reasons. Like it's here. Sometimes it comes through these Western NGOs. Like you'll see like a ridiculous headline in Pravda. Oh, this was just yesterday. So Pravda wrote a story about how happy some British family was to have a transgender kid. But this what some people call the homosexual agenda has a sword and a shield, right? I agree with the shield. I agree that if you want to do that, it's fine, right? And I think they use this shield to defend themselves. But then comes the sword when they start teaching 13-year-olds about sodomy, when they start just like making it public.
Yeah, I always joke that there should be an 11th command in the Bible called "Thou shalt keep thy degeneracy for thyself."
Yes.
Because in general, I mean, even with the tranny thingy, I mean, who cares? It's their body. If they do it with their own shekels, that's fine. But with 3-year-olds, no.
Yeah.
No, because no.
Yeah, or you listen to some of these leftists, how eager they are to get into school and get kids as young as they can and talk to them about masturbation and stuff like that. It's so degenerate, and it's I always use communism as a barometer. You told me about, was it Romania or Hungary's communist leader?
Hungary, Bela Kun.
Yeah.
Bela Kun government in 1918-19. Yeah.
Yeah, so before the 1920s even, he just made things super degenerate, sex ed, free sex, all this stuff. So I guess maybe most people aren't like us intermarium folk, but I use association with communism as sort of a smell test. If the commies are doing it, it's probably bad. So anyway, sword and a shield. I don't mind the stuff that they generally defend themselves with, but then you get the sword. And you do see headlines, like I said, in Pravda about how happy some British family was to have a transgender kid. I hope most people are kind of saying, that doesn't seem right. And I think most people are. That might be my own bias, but I don't see it as very big here. I see them like, okay, this is obviously coming from some NGO, so they're here, it's on people's minds. I do think there are people who sit around a table and think about how to promote this stuff. So far it seems small, and I hope it stays that way.
Okay. I don't know if you've followed the recently passed policy about minority language schools.
Yes.
Have you followed the controversy? What's your take on it?
Yeah, just enough to know that it's there. So there was some law passed and signed, making forcing students in school to learn Ukrainian from a certain grade, a certain amount of Ukrainian education, and there was outcry among Poles, Romanians, and Russians. And Hungarians, thank you. We're in a war. A big part of this war is sort of a war over our history. The Ukrainian national myth fundamentally contradicts the Russian national myth. They can't exist side by side. So, and I also think that if you put the facts on the table, the Ukrainian version is more accurate. And I'm obviously biased there, but
even if it hadn't been more accurate, I would say the border is there and it should stay there, and there is a reason it exists.
Yeah.
And if you disagree with it, there is such thing called the airport. And get the full.
Yeah, right. Good fences make good borders. Anyway, so as part of this sort of trying to control our history, they're mandating the teaching of Ukrainian. By contrast, there have been I forget whether it was 200 or 400 separate documented outlawings of the Ukrainian language by the Russians during Tsarist Russia, during the Soviet Union. There's a story recorded, I'm not sure where it's recorded, it might have been in Robert Conquest's books, who wrote about the famine genocide, Holodomor, of some NKVD guy just shooting people on sight if they were speaking Ukrainian in the middle of Kyiv. So the language has been violently oppressed. I have no problem with mandating its teaching in Ukrainian public schools. There's been outcry from the countries you mentioned, Poland, Romanian, Hungarian people. I was glad to hear from you that in Chernivtsi, which is a Romanian-Ukrainian city inside of Ukraine, that people thought it was no big deal.
Yeah, by and large, they either believed it was no big deal, or they were asking themselves, why are we arguing with the Romanians? I mean, we go there to work, they come here and do their shopping. Why do we have to argue with them? Why do we have to be unfriendly with them?
Right.
Same thing in Lviv. Why do we have to be unfriendly with the Poles? I mean, haven't we had enough wars already? And, in Lviv, I'm sure you know, there was quite a serious business between Ukrainians and Poles.
But both my grandfathers were part of that struggle, yeah. And I guess for people unfamiliar with this part of the world, we should also say that both the Russians and the Soviets have been extremely successful promoting these regional conflicts to get us intermarium countries fighting each other and ignoring the bigger threat of Russia or of the Soviet Union. So one of the controversies between Ukraine and Poland was a lot of very brutal partisan war in the Volyn Oblast, where each side accuses the other of genocide, and both are probably right, and ethnic cleansing. Russia pushes stories in both the Ukrainian press and in the Polish press trying to fan the flames of this disagreement. I was really happy to see a few months ago nationalists from both sides sort of did a meeting just to recognize the general tragedy of what happened there and to say that we're friends now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when Poland or Ukraine takes some measures against that, I mean, in Poland there have been a few raids in various, I guess, editorial teams that were sponsored by the Kremlin.
Have there been?
Yeah. And then you see the Brussels, oh my God, more freedom of the press. And I'm like, how about our freedom of the press?
Right.
I mean, seriously, the FSB factories get to speak freely, and when we say no, you're all wrong and insane, that's suddenly breaching their freedom of the press. Really? Yep. Because this is going to be quite an issue, and it's coming to Ukraine, whether Ukrainians like it or not, because at the moment there is this thing, oh, we're going to join the EU eventually and whatnot, and I don't think this will go smoothly, because Brussels is in direct contradiction with inter marium ideals,
right?
Because Brussels is doing business with Russia. I mean, when the U.S., when Trump was always accused of being pro-Russian, signed even harsher sanctions against Russia, who were the first people to protest? There was the Austrian Chancellor, the German Chancellor, and the bureaucrats in Brussels. These were the people that were protesting the sanctions. It wasn't the Ukrainians, it wasn't the Romanians, it wasn't the Poland, it wasn't even the Hungarian government, also accused of being pro-Putin quite often, but they didn't protest. The protest was coming from the bureaucrats in Brussels.
It's insane, and they push that narrative so hard, and then it's just fallen on the face, and they don't take any responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. There's one of the postmodernist philosophers. Postmodernist philosophers has this general idea that you can't really know anything for sure, nothing's really true, nothing's better than anything else. And if they honestly applied that idea, they would fall prey to their own logic, right? Because your ideas are just as uncritical. But anyway, they were all radical leftists. Mm-hmm. They would attack the right and say you can't really know anything, but what we know is definitely true. Anyway, Richard Rorty pretty much admits the leftist program, and he says, I think a good left is a left that forgets its past sins and focuses on the next thing. I hate the lack of accountability.
Yeah, because
for their own lives.
Accountability is for idiots, I guess, these days. The thing is that sooner or later this will have to be an issue, because how will the joining to the EU will be promoted here? Because Ukrainians are stupid. They're gonna read the news, and they're gonna notice that there is slight of a disconnect between we're going to join the Eurosayus and everything will be fine, and then they'll be looking, especially the people in the border regions, the Poles in Lviv and the Romanians in Zakarpatska and Chernivtsi Oblast, they cross the border, some of them several times a day, and they get into Romania or in Poland, and they speak around, and they're like, hold on a second, this thing is
you may be, I wonder if you're not attributing your own beliefs to the general public here. I haven't seen polls for a while, but it's a clear majority here that wants to join the EU, and I think we have slightly different takes on the EU. So let's articulate them, because it might be interesting for the people. I generally have the impression that for Romania and for Poland, joining the EU forced them to reform some internal corruption. So the EU is just a tool to fix some internal problems, and I think it might be the same for Ukraine. The EU and the international community is putting a lot of pressure on Poroshenko. It seems like some of the anti-corruption steps that he did take were to appease these pressures. So I view the EU as a vehicle that might help Ukraine fight corruption as they did in Romania and Poland. I know you disagree with that outright, so what's your view?
No, I don't disagree with that outright. I would rather, however, insist a bit on some nuances. For instance, the first anti-corruption measures in Romania started long before the prospect of joining the EU was even a thing. Secondly, yes, there were a few critical moments when Brussels supported the efforts, but they were starting from within the society and not at the suggestion of the Brussels. And more importantly, I don't trust Brussels to be consistent, because now Poland is doing exactly the same thing that we did in Romania in 2004, 2005, 2006.
Which is what?
Which is to try to clean up the judiciary of former commie appointees and whatnot. And when we did it in 2006, Brussels was like, yeah, okay, yeah, that needs to be done. Now, when Poland is doing the exact same thing, even their laws, some of them, I think, they have some Polish guy there that speaks Romanian and translated them because they're almost word for word.
Okay.
Now, Warsaw is being accused of breaching judicial independence, and they're being considered for sanctions for the exact same policy, mind you.
That's totally partisan, because they were doing that to get rid of activist judges, which happened to be promoting ideas that Brussels liked. Is that correct?
Yeah, not only that, but they're also partisan because the bureaucrats really don't like the power in Warsaw now.
Right.
They hate Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, or the Law and Justice, the party that is in power now in Poland. Most bureaucrats just hate it emotionally. I mean, they just go into allergic reactions when you say in public Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, because and I sort of understand them, because they're accustomed to this, postmodernist, you can call it globalist thinking that they have in the bureaucracy, whereas Prawo i Sprawiedliwość is a party formed mostly by people down to earth. I wouldn't even call them nationalists. They're like, look, we've been doing things a certain way since the time of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So that's about 700 years. That's a little bit older than the European Union. I think that we've been doing this way. It worked very well. We shouldn't change it. So, for instance, we've been doing family this way for 800 years. That's fine. We shouldn't change it. We've been doing, I don't know, primary schools. They still work on a similar church-influenced model that has been there since the 1300s.
You need to respect your ancestors. They got us to where we are.
Yeah,
and as bad as it is, it could be a whole lot worse.
Yeah, and the thing is that Prawo i Sprawiedliwość is not willing to renounce any of these things, especially considering that they can prove that they work. And, they have this fundamentally conservative mentality, which I also share. If it ain't broken, then try to fix it. And even if you're not a conservative, one should appreciate that, look, it's their country. This particular political party is very popular, which means most Poles agree with that kind of mentality. What's so wrong about it? And, it's also funny that whenever you hear leftists, but women in politics. Well, most women in politics, especially those that ended up being prime ministers, were all from conservative parties.
Right.
I mean, the prime minister of Poland, Beata Szydło, is also from this hardline conservative party, and Margaret Thatcher, of course.
Yeah, and feminists will never celebrate any of them.
Of course not. I mean, I've seen a Polish feminist who lives in the United Kingdom writing in a closed-circuit publication, which probably leftists would be horrified if they knew I'd read it. But anyway, they were basically saying that probably Beata Szydło is not even a woman, because how dare she support pro-life efforts? How dare she support natural family policies centered around the natural family, and reject what I would like to call the LGBTist religion, which I usually refer to, because it's really a religion at this point. So yeah, that's why I don't agree necessarily with, the EU could be a vehicle, or I've heard other thinkers refer to it as a necessary evil for some intermarium countries, namely that, look...
I guess that's what I'm saying.
You basically said
a temporary thing to fix corruption, and then let it collapse.
Yeah, 10 years ago I would have agreed with this narrative, but now seeing Brussels being completely inconsistent with its supposed ideals, I mean, they always speak about European values, but God forbid you apply European values consistently.
Yeah, right. Or God forbid you apply the idea of tolerance to conservative, Catholic, or Orthodox communities.
Yeah, or just apply them consistently. Again, I'm going back to this judiciary thing. We did one thing. Brussels was okay with it. Now Prawo i Sprawiedliwość is doing the exact same thing in Poland.
Yes.
It's not okay, because potato. That's why I don't trust the EU, and that's why... I'm asking you, how do you see the near future, I guess, in the next 5-6 years for this country, for Ukraine? Because these kinds of contradictions will show up. in Ukraine too. I mean, let's say you get President Saakashvili, who is much more of a conservative dude. I mean, he's much more pro-capitalism than I guess any other mainstream politician in this area, but he's also very socially conservative.
Well,
he's not that bureaucrat guy.
One important difference here, like self-determination for most intermarium countries means resisting the cultural Marxism of the West. And that's the lens through which a lot of my friends all the way from the United States look at Ukraine. Self-determination for Ukraine has always meant resisting Russia. Always. And that supersedes anything else. So, like, Ukrainian nationalism is different than the other nationalisms because most of the other European nationalisms, because while they're trying to resist this Western cultural Marxist idea that nationality doesn't exist and we don't have to defend our culture, or on one hand our culture doesn't exist, on the other hand our culture is evil. So that's what preserving your identity means for most European countries, but for Ukraine it's different. We are not Russia. We're a separate people with a separate history. We've always been here. We have not always had a state. But that doesn't mean we weren't here. We had a distinct culture that traces back to Kyiv I, which was the largest political entity of its time.
Yeah, I guess it is Ukraine will continue to be a special case in the Intermarium in many ways because at the very least, every other country in the Intermarium either had its small empire or definitely more period throughout history when they had a state. I mean, Hungary I was part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. Poland had its Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Romania was unified several times in the last millennium, culminating...
Moldova had its empire.
No, it didn't.
I'm just trying to trigger you.
No, it didn't. But the thing is that, Moldova is, again, a country that nobody really understands why it exists. But anyway, not even Moldovans understand why Moldova exists. So there's that. But Ukraine didn't. Ukraine didn't have its own empire in the last 500 or 600 years.
Okay, in the last 500 or 600 years, Ukraine traces its identity back to Kyiv Rus.
The Kyivian Rus.
Yeah, Kyivian Rus. We saw a number of apocalypses here that the rest of Europe did not. The first apocalypse was the Mongolian horde, where I think all but 4 buildings in this city were destroyed. The huge areas were utterly depopulated. I can't imagine what it was like. And then we saw the Ottoman slave trades. Which extended all the way up to Finland, if I understand. It wasn't just taking Ukrainians, but for 500 years, the Black Sea slave trade traded about 6 million people, which is about half the size of the Atlantic slave trade. Happened over a longer period of time, but at a time when there was much more sparse settlements. So that's completely, down the memory hole. No one talks about the Black Sea slave trade.
Well, if you include for the Bosphorus Strait and all the people that were carried from
overland,
what would now be northern Bulgaria, western Balkans, present-day Albania, present-day Bosnia. If you include all of that, the Ottoman slave trade utterly dwarfs the Atlantic slave trade. Whatever period you take, I mean, even in the 1600s, when the United States still didn't exist and the whole slave trade thing was yet to happen, the Ottoman Empire was still thriving in the slave trade there. So in many ways, and this is particularly for the Americans who might be watching this video, we've been knowing that thing for quite some time. Probably that's why we're not so social justice warriors.
Right, exactly. That's why we're a little bit immune to a lot of the tropes that
because you want to talk about systemic historical oppression.
Right.
Well, welcome to the Intermarium, bitch. I mean, seriously.
Right.
Poland disappeared from the map several times. By comparison, any sort of individual who claims systemic historical oppression in Sweden or the United States, I mean, really, that's just being a spoiled brat in comparison to, or even present-day people. I mean, let's not forget, most of the people in this country, particularly in Ukraine, were born in the Soviet Union. Most of the adult population either has been himself or herself, or has a close relative who has stand in line for bread and who has gone several days without eating because there was no food, because that's how communism ends up in practice. That's a lot more of a claim of historical oppression than probably anything that's coming from the West.
My wife has a story about her aunt. They had a little gold cross that someone had from some Tsarist military decoration, and they would break off pieces of this gold cross and take it to town and sell it so they could buy bread. When I think about all the tragedy from the Mongolian apocalypse to the Soviet Union, I'm really glad I'm here. Really glad my ancestors made it, and it kind of makes me like, I have no excuses.
We can definitely say that on a historical scale, this is by far the best period that Ukraine is going through.
Oh yeah, for sure. But let me add continuity to the story. So it's Mongolia, Kyiv I, which we don't know all that much about because the chronicles were written by the monarch himself, and a lot of the chronicles were destroyed by the Tsar later. So that ended with the Mongolian invasion, and then this was the frontier. So frontiers are a special thing. I think they ought to be discussed as a special thing. And like maybe the symbol of pirates on the sea, like maybe the symbol of cowboys in the United States, we have the symbol of the Cossack, which is something in between. It's huge freedom and an alternative way of existing. A little bit criminal, but mostly freedom. So we have the symbol of the Cossacks. And for much of history, Ukraine was that. It was rivaling civilizations, whether it be Ottoman, Russian, the Polish monarch, and then the Cossacks just having periodic rebellions or allying with one of those three to war with another one of those three. There were like little flare-ups of statehood. There was a big flare-up of statehood during World War I, but we didn't make it. And then, Okay, so that's Ukraine's story there. I wanted to share Ukraine's story.
Right. Let's go a little bit to, because that's how how we got to meet each other. You plugged my video about Duginism.
Right. Fantastic
into
video.
Another podcast. I won't name the podcast because they interviewed me and they didn't publish it in due time. And I'm very pissed about that because in that podcast I predicted the Catalan uprising. And now when they'll publish it, everyone
will think you're,
we would think that I'm out of sync with the news.
Yeah, that it was hindsight.
Yeah, that was recorded
foresight.
Over a month ago, long before anyone knew that anything would happen in Catalonia. And I was like, the next step, because the guy who interviewed you, when he was interviewing me, he was asking, what will be the next move of the Duginists? And I'm like, probably the next move will be to try something in Catalonia because that's the easiest target right now, and they always go for the easiest target.
Man, first. we ought to do a quick video about that because I don't know, I don't get it that was a Duginist thing, that was a Russian thing.
Well, first of all,
Spain has always been a republic with very strong. I don't know if they call them states or what do they call them?
Autonomies.
Yeah, a lot of regional autonomy, and always, or for the last 500 years at least.
Yeah, the thing is that this time the whole referendum thing, which is really not popular at all. I mean, as I've shown you a few days ago, there was a counter demonstration that dwarfed entirely the numbers that the independence has for remaining in Spain. The whole thing was initiated by the Communist Party, the Podemos, which everyone knows.
Well, I know the Catalonians lean left, as do the Scots. The thing is, if either one of them becomes autonomous, like, they're really small, so all that leftist nonsense will go out the window very fast.
Yeah, but I would rather not gamble with the majority of the people's lives, because the majority in Catalonia do not support independence. I mean,
that statistic did not make it into my newsfeed, and I'm surprised to hear it, but I haven't been looking.
Even the whole referendum, I mean, there's enormous amount of evidence, and even the organizers admitted that all the evidence that was published on the internet is mostly true, namely that you could vote several times. So really, even with all that fraud, the turnout was 42%. And of the 42%, something like 75% voted for the independence. But remember, a significant portion of those votes are multiple votes.
Voted twice, yeah.
Twice or more.
Sure.
I mean, there's pictures of the same person voting 15 times. And they interviewed that person. It was like, yeah, I really want independence. And if it's possible, why not? And I guess they have a point. I mean, if it's possible, why not? But that's not how you organize an independence referendum. Anyway, the thing is that the Communist Party in Spain, the Podemos, is funded by Tehran and Moscow. This is not a secret in Spanish politics. I mean, everyone knows it. And begrudgingly, I guess they admitted, yeah, we took a loan from. But it was a loan. We're paying it back. Sure, you do, honey.
Wow.
I'm sure you will. But the thing is that when Dugin or Duginists, I would say, because Dugin himself keeps his hands very clean. I mean, you don't. But when his followers or people influenced by his way of thinking act somewhere, it's usually something that already exists there. They're augmenting something.
Oh yeah, I get that.
I'm not saying that Dugin or Russia in general created all the problems in Catalonia. Of course not, because they couldn't. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. But they augmented the most radical segments in it to create trouble, to destabilize, because that's what they do.
Yeah, I see that as well. I would express it this way. I see they say, what beliefs exist in this society? Which of these would be useful to us? And they find a way to push it. When the war in Georgia in 2009 happened, I had a blog, which is mostly just a repository for interesting stories. It never had many readers, but I trusted the Libertarian press. I loved their criticism of the Iraq War. We may disagree on that as well, but I trusted Ron Paul. I was a huge Ron Paul supporter. And then when the Russian-Georgian War happened, I was, quote, Lou Rockwell, Ron Paul. I would post their stories on my blog. You know, some company approached me and said, hey, put this little ad on your blog and you'll get, it was like $30 or $40 a month. And it was some weird, it was a link to a weird website, something to do with credit cards. But that was the only time anyone ever made a commercial, a serious commercial contact with me and gave me that much money for the blog. I think that was some Russian guys who saw me posting pro-Russia stories about pushing the Russian narrative in Georgia. And some guy anonymously contacts me, says, hey, add this link to your blog, we'll pay you $40 a month. So I can't prove it, but I think they just fingered me as just a guy who's promoting the narrative that we want, so let's give him a little bit of support.
These kinds of things did happen. Now, of course, I don't know if that particular case was indeed one, but these kinds of things did happen with smaller and bigger publications. Ben Shapiro was talking about how he was approached by someone that everyone knew was in connection with the Kremlin, because he was about to publish a story connecting to Ukrainian politics, and he was being fed facts filtered through the pro-Russian narrative. And to his credit, Ben Shapiro was like, hold on a second, something really doesn't add up here. And when he was contacted and encouraged to publish the story, he was like, nah, probably not. Probably not. If the Kremlin, he was working with Breitbart at the time. Okay. If the Kremlin really wants this story published, then probably we shouldn't. Probably we shouldn't. And he eventually did publish it 3 months later, once he actually got the non-Russian perspective on it. And it was really something minor. But that shows you the extent to which. And when I say all of these things, it's easy to people to think that I'm very conspiratorial or whatnot. But think of it this way: this is not coordinated necessarily. There's a network of people who genuinely believe these things, and then they try to put it this way. This is what I'm trying to build myself around my ideas. To have a generalized network of people who believe things similarly, not necessarily identical, but similarly with me, and then I can just appeal to them, and most of the time don't even have to coordinate. I mean, this is a method that everyone should be using, but for now, only the KGB is using it.
Well, when I try to convince people of how Russia moves the narrative, I refer them to the Yuri Bezmenov interview, Deception Was My Job. And he was a KGB agent, and he talks about how they had long lists of influence makers down to little groups of people. And he was even dispatched to California in the 60s or 70s to make contact with some transcendental meditation movement, just to see if they couldn't use a little help, because Russia liked their idea. Let's talk about Russia-Trump.
Okay.
Because I think that was nonsense. I think it's transparently nonsense. And as a guy who who spent some devoted some research time and wrote some articles exposing Russian propaganda, I don't want to be associated with the Russia-Trump nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk Russia-Trump. Bollocks, fake news by the CNN and the former newspaper, what's it called, the Pravda on Hudson.
Yeah, and Russia ran with it. I think what happened was this: Russia allies with the opposition, and I would always tell I have a tweet. So here's the evidence we're talking about when you want credit for predicting something. So I said, look, Russia is not pro-Trump; they're pro-opposition. They thought Clinton would win, and that the American right would be in opposition to President Clinton. So they spent a lot of time building their image as an ally of the right. And then I wrote, but she lost. So what do you think Russia is doing now? They're supporting the left. And last week or the week before, there came a story that Russia was promoting Black Lives Matter. Russia is pro-opposition and pro-conflict, and the Russia-Trump story was it was branding that I would say Russia started, thinking that Trump supporters would be the American opposition, but then the American journalists, in an attempt to discredit Trump, they ran with it. That's my take, and I'm pretty confident that that's accurate.
I wouldn't be surprised if this would be entirely the case, because it is very consistent with Duginist ideology. Dugin explains himself in Osnova Geopolitics, the overview of geopolitics. He explains that what we, as in Russia, we're supposed to do is promote discontent. And he explicitly mentions we should try supporting the extreme racist movements in the United States, especially the Afro-Negro movements. I mean, he explains it plainly, and he was explaining this in 1997. I mean, it's not something new. And that book is the playbook of the Ministry of Propaganda in Kremlin today.
More people need to know this.
These kinds of things are not new, and I'm not surprised at all that the Kremlin had even if it's a small finger into Black Lives Matter. I'm not surprised at all, because it's very consistent with the playbook that the Kremlin is playing by. As for the support of pro-opposition, I don't know, maybe. What I do know is that ever since the times of the KGB, I mean, Bezmenov himself explained this, Ion Mihai Pacepa, the deserter from the Romanian Securitate, also explained this when he defected to the United States. The point of subversion is always to try to subvert those that you disagree with. You don't subvert the left, because they will always fall in line, because there will always be useful idiots, because that's why they're leftists. You try to subvert the right, because the right is much harder to subvert, because it's always fragmented.
Yes, I remember that.
I mean, and that's why I'm not surprised that, at least apparently, there were some attempts to support the Trump's campaign. But in reality, trying to actually, to claim that Trump won because of Russian support,
it's so stupid.
No, it is that kind of extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Now, I'm willing to change my opinion about this, but bring me some extraordinary evidence that matches up the claim.
The numbers came out. Google saw less than $5,000 worth of suspicious advertising, and Facebook saw, it was like, I don't know, 50 or something, $50,000 worth. Hillary spent $1 billion on the campaign.
Trump spent $200 million, so I mean, sure. I mean, out of $200 million, and in general, Trump's campaign, because he benefited, let's face it, he used the stupidity of the press against them, and he benefited from about $1 billion of free advertising. Well, it came out that the Clinton presidency saw him as the jester. And the Clinton the advice of the Clinton, or the commands that the Clinton campaign gave to the different television networks, was to promote Trump against the other Republican rivals, because they decided that Trump was easier to beat than the other Republicans. Yeah, well, I mean,
so he got free publicity, not just because of his own antics, but the Clintons wanted him to have the publicity.
But then again, none of this can be imputed to Trump. It's not his fault that the opposition played a bad hand and lost. I mean, at the end of the day, in a presidential, especially at this level of presidential campaign of the United States, you need a bit of a luck. You need a bit of a mistake from the opponent.
Yeah, it's part of the game.
It's part of the game. I mean, that's the game that both candidates signed up for. And those are the rules, and that's how things have been done since since 100 years now.
Right.
Basically, I mean, well, actually less than 100 years, about 70 years since the whole televised debates became a thing. There was I think it was in the 60s, a debate in which the people who heard it on the radio believed that one side won, and the people who saw it on TV firmly believed that the other side won. I don't remember the exact name.
I don't remember that one.
Ben Shapiro keeps bringing up this example, showing that how important televised debates have been to shifting the American politics in one way or the other. Because it is a show in the end of the day. I mean, the CNN scoffs of the idea that Trump sees everything as a reality show. Well, you may not like it, but it is a reality show. I mean, it is. Politics has become, at least in part, especially these kinds of person-oriented partisan politics. Now, in general, the ideas, of course, are mostly the same. I mean, there's nothing really new in politics since Marxism. Nothing really new. I mean, everything is very old. I have a friend who is now preparing himself to become a pastor, I think it's called, in his particular Christian denomination. And in college, he had a course called Dogmatics. What Dogmatics meant was any text written after the 1400s is forbidden. Is forbidden. All texts have to be 600 years old or older. And he was like, every single political philosophy and idea and practical politics and everything was at least in one text that is 600 years or older. Including Marxism. It wasn't called Marxism.
Sure.
The name is new, but the idea, the politics of envy, has been there for many
I think
Nietzsche
might say that Christianity was sort of a rallying of weak people against the strong and successful, based in jealousy. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but you can make that comparison that Christianity sort of rallied the weak against the strong, or that he would say that in a similar way that Marxism tries to rally the underclasses. But I don't want to lose the takeaway, what you said earlier in this discussion, that Dugin is open about it, open that we should promote strife in other countries, specifically promote racial strife in the United States as a means of fracturing it. Some people would support that idea, but I want more. That's a really important idea. Russia is open about its propaganda strategy. I want more people to know that. And if you want more people to know that, subscribe to Lucian's, subscribe to his Patreon. I've donated there. And you should too, because it's awesome, and the intermarium would make the world a better place.
I don't think it would make necessarily the world a better place, because the intermarium, whatever configuration it will take, I mean, these days it's called the 3Cs Initiative, and it's going to have to be built around Poland, Romania, and Croatia, basically, so it has to be 3Cs. And definitely Hungary and Slovakia in between. But it will definitely make Europe at least appear to be more of an alternative, because for now the only alternative you have in Europe to the insanity in Brussels is the corruption in Russia. And to make things worse, the insanity in Brussels is collaborating with the insanity in Russia to the detriment of us, basically, the intermarium. And there just seems to be no stopping in this lunacy train, and the intermarium would be indeed a step in a different direction. Of course, it won't be perfect. Of course, it will have its flaws. But then again, perfection doesn't exist.
Sure.
Not in politics. I mean, I always tell people that if you want saints, you may try church. If you believe in that, because you might encounter a saint in the church. But in politics, don't look up for saints. They simply don't exist. Now, you mentioned Ron Paul, so while we're on Russia, what do you think happened to Ron Paul himself and the whole thing associated with him, that they went full Duginist, essentially?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, like, look at my series of essays starting with Putin's Libertarians, which I was happy to see them get a little bit of traction. So, like, especially coming out of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace, like, they're publishing such demonstrably false stories. Yes, I am biased, all right? Ukraine is my heritage. We're at war with Russia, but I think I just lay out so much information, so many, like, glaring falsehoods coming out of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and other libertarian organizations that there's just no way that it's an accident. I think Ron Paul is an honorable gentleman, and he just trusts the people around him, and he has some bad people around him. That's what I think.
Okay, because wouldn't it be an augmentation? And again, I don't know if I necessarily blame Ron Paul. Quite frankly, I don't care what he thinks, but definitely his biases have been exploited. Because and this is a weakness, which is why I always call myself a conservative libertarian and not a libertarian, because the libertarian bias towards full isolationism is just not realistic.
I've made this argument to people, like with regarding isolation. Well, I've made two arguments. First of all, social norms should be regarded as property. A lot of libertarianism ignores social norms, including the norm that you defend your neighbors, sort of like a fraternal brotherhood, mutual insurance. So that's number one. Second, like, if you want non-intervention for some active aggression happening overseas, okay, but treat that the same way that you would treat a crime that happens on the other side of your neighborhood. Okay, maybe it's too far away for you to help. Maybe it's too expensive for you to help. Maybe it's too dangerous for you to help. Maybe that guy who keeps getting robbed needs to learn to take care of himself. So do it for any of those reasons, but don't lie about it. You know, call it for what it is. So I've appealed to friends that way, like, sure, non-intervention. You know, maybe Ukraine needs to take care of itself, but don't lie about what's happening here.
So what you're basically saying that if there is to be a win for the non-interventionist narrative, at the very least it should be honest, namely that, look, we can't afford, we don't want to.
Yeah, there's a lot of honest reasons to make that argument, but don't do what I saw a lot of libertarians do, is I believe in non-intervention, therefore I'm going to support this idea that Ukraine was killing Russian speakers, or any of these stupid narratives that came out of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace, which are just lies.
Those are really straight up manufactured stories. Right. Well, I guess that would be enough for this particular episode. We're probably going to record at least another one later on this week. Anyway, by the time you'll be watching this, I'll be get back to Romania, and probably by the time I'm publishing this, I'll be in another city again, because there's a lot of traveling happening towards the end of this year. But anyway, that will be pretty much it for this episode, so we won't bore everyone. And probably in the next episode, you'll be asking me stuff.
Great. Yeah, we might do a review of history.
No, okay. That's not particularly my best topic, but we'll try.
For me, you're a wealth of information. Thanks for having me.
Right. Thank you for coming to my show. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.